Hello there. A little rainy today, but cloudy, kind of overcast, but I found a little spot to do the next tip video, which I wanted to talk to you about aperture. We talked about shutter priority, so now let's talk a little bit about aperture priority and what that means. Quick review, we talked about how the aperture and the shutter act together to let the correct amount of light in, and they are complementing each other, right? As your shutter speed gets faster, your aperture needs to get wider. As your aperture gets smaller, your shutter speed needs to get slower to let the same amount of light in. So why would you want to be on aperture priority instead of shutter priority? Shutter priority, we said, is for speed, motion, those type of things, capturing sporting events and all that. Where the aperture comes into play is it will control your depth of field. What is depth of field, Straub? Depth of field is how much of everything that's in the frame will be in focus from the focal point to in front of and behind. When you hit autofocus, you know, when you hit your button and the camera focuses on your subject, you know that'll be in focus. But what about behind and in front? You can actually control that through aperture priority. So the wider the aperture is, the less distance in between the subject will be in focus. This is the type of thing, if you looked at a Land's End catalog or an Eddie Bauer catalog, you're going to see the perfect family standing on the perfect dock in front of the perfect lake with the beautiful mountain behind. But our eyes and brains perceive all of that scenery as, look at this family out on a camping adventure, and by golly, I just have to have those shorts. But if you take a good look at the picture, most likely everything in the background is going to be slightly out of focus or really out of focus. Why? Because the catalog company, the salespeople, they want you to see the vest that mom is wearing, or the pants that dad is wearing, or the hiking boots that the kid is wearing, because that's what they want you to be drawn to. They don't necessarily care what mountain it is or what lake. They want you to see the clothes so that you go, oh my god, I gotta have that, and I'm gonna look that cool when I go to wherever, and you portray your scene of being in the Adirondacks or Lake Placid or wherever you're gonna be. So same thing for me when I photograph a wedding or a high school senior. Sometimes you just want the person to be in focus as opposed to the whole scene. So the wider your aperture is, the less will be in focus, and that's called selective focus. Your depth of field will be affected. If you use a very small aperture, what will happen is everything begins to be in focus. Someone like Ansel Adams or Galen Rowell, they use this type of, both are no longer with us, but both use a much smaller aperture to capture every single detail. They want you to see the bark in the tree. They want you to see every line through the leaf. They want every cloud in the sky to look pristine. So that's why you see a lot of landscape photographers using tripods, because they're using tiny little apertures, so the shutter speed needs to slow down. So they don't want any camera shake or any motion blur to be captured. So when you are doing aperture priority, it's more about a non-moving subject. It's more about how much detail you want to capture in the picture, that type of thing. The confusing part is the larger the number, that means the smaller the aperture. So f16 would be a much smaller opening through the lens than f2.8. So if you're in a low light situation, you want to be at f2.8 so that you can let a lot of light in and have a faster shutter speed. But just remember, you may not get everything in focus because of the depth of field issue. On the other hand, If you're outside and you want to capture this beautiful scene at a lake, you want to go to a deep aperture. And when I say deep, I mean so that everything is in focus, a small number. And by doing that, you have a deeper depth of field. So your whole picture will be in focus, but it's going to slow your shutter speed down. So that's where all the other complications come in. If it's a bright sunny day, it probably won't be that much of a problem. You'll still be at a high enough shutter speed that you can handhold the camera. But it may or may not be. And that's where it gets a little more complicated. Anyway, maybe that'll be the next lesson, the combination of the two. But today I just wanted to let you know what aperture priority was all about. And, you know, as I'm doing these, you know, hit me up with any questions you have. And this one's really going long because kind of enjoying sitting here on this bench in solitude. Had to go pay the mortgage, so stopped at the library. See? Now I gotta go back home. Later.